One medieval nun faked her own death complete with a sham funeral, just to escape the convent walls and live a different life. Elsewhere, two royal princesses who had taken vows as nuns led a violent gang of outlaws, seizing property and even physically attacking their own abbess. Imagine an abbess so defiant, she basically told bishops and archbishops her business was her own, continuing to preach and compose music even when forbidden. And then there were nuns who challenged the very foundations of church teachings, with one woman choosing to face flames rather than give up her mystical beliefs. Some nuns managed vast estates and political alliances from within their cloisters, while others faced terrifying accusations and brutal punishments for breaking their sacred vows of chastity. Number 8. Joan of Leeds, the nun who pulled off a daring death stunt. Joan of Leeds was a nun at the Priory of St. Clement by York, a Benedictine house in the early 14th century. Life in a medieval convent wasn't for everyone. For Joan, it seems the quiet, disciplined routine became too much to bear. By 1318, she had decided she wanted out. But leaving a convent wasn't like quitting a job. It was a sacred commitment for life. So Joan came up with a plan, a truly dramatic one. According to the records of William Melton, the Archbishop of York, Joan didn't just run away. She faked her own death. The Archbishop wrote that Joan, with the help and counsel of certain malicious individuals, had pretended to be seriously ill. She then, the record states, feigned death. It wasn't just a case of telling people she died. Her accomplices apparently created a dummy, a likeness of her body. This dummy was then sacrilegiously and damnably buried in the cemetery of the said priory. It was a full-blown fake funeral, with everyone believing she was dead and buried. Joan was free. She slipped out of the priory and, as Archbishop Melton put it, began wandering at large. He was not amused. His official register entry on the matter described her actions as a notorious peril to her soul and to the scandal of her whole order. He clearly saw her escape as a serious offense against God and the Church. The Archbishop ordered Joan to return to St. Clement's immediately. He instructed his officials to find her and bring her back, so she could do penance for her scandalous conduct. He also threatened anyone who might be helping her or hiding her with excommunication, a very serious spiritual punishment. What happened to Joan of Leeds after this? The historical record, unfortunately, goes quiet. We don't know if she was ever found and returned to the priory. We don't know if she successfully evaded capture and lived out her life under a new identity. Her story is a fascinating glimpse into the desperation some might have felt within monastic walls and the extraordinary lengths one woman went to in order to regain her freedom. It reads like a plot from a novel. The feigned illness, the dummy in the coffin, the secret escape. Joan of Leeds' rebellion was a personal one, a bold rejection of the life chosen for her, or perhaps one she chose and later regretted, played out with theatrical flair. Number 7. Basina and Chlothild, the royal rebel nuns, who waged war on their abbey. In the late 6th century, long before Joan of Leeds, two Frankish princesses took rebellion to a whole new violent level. Basina was the daughter of King Chilperic I, and Chlothild claimed to be the daughter of King Charibert I. Both were nuns at the prestigious Abbey of the Holy Cross in Poitiers, a convent founded by the famous Queen Saint Radegund. But these royal nuns were not content with quiet prayer and contemplation. Around the year 589, Basina and Chlothild decided they'd had enough of their Abbess Euphemia. They accused her of being too strict and of treating them poorly. So they rallied a group of other dissatisfied nuns, reportedly around 40 of them, and simply walked out of the abbey. This was a huge scandal in itself. But they didn't just leave. Basina and Chlothild, drawing on their royal connections and a certain ruthlessness, decided to take matters into their own hands. Gregory of Tours, a historian of the time, tells us they gathered an army. This wasn't an army of knights. It was a motley crew, described by Gregory as murderers, adulterers, thieves, runaways, and criminals of all kinds. With this band of thugs, the princess nuns began to cause chaos. They first sought support from King Guntram, one of their relatives, hoping he would intervene on their behalf and remove Abbess Euphemia. While they waited for royal judgment, they didn't sit idly. They set up a camp near the abbey and began to seize church lands and properties. Their gang terrorized the local area. When bishops tried to intervene and order the nuns back to the convent, Basina and Chlothild refused. They even had some of the bishop's envoys beaten and robbed. The situation escalated. The rebellious nuns and their hired army eventually launched a direct assault on the Abbey of the Holy Cross itself. They broke down the doors, dragged Abbess Euphemia out, and according to Gregory, beat her severely. They locked her up and essentially took over the abbey. This armed insurrection by a group of nuns, led by princesses, threw the region into turmoil. It took a council of bishops and the intervention of secular rulers to eventually suppress the revolt. The bishops excommunicated Basina, Chlothild, and their followers. After much negotiation and even some fighting between their gang and forces loyal to the authorities, the rebellion was quashed. Basina was eventually allowed to return to a different convent after doing penance, while Chlothild, who proved harder to control, faced a more uncertain fate, though she too seems to have eventually been reconciled in some way. Their story is a stark reminder that medieval convents weren't always peaceful retreats, and that royal blood and strong wills could lead to rebellions that were anything but holy. Number 6. Hildegard of Bingen, the visionary, who dared to challenge popes and emperors. Hildegard of Bingen, who lived from 1098 to 1179, was one of the most extraordinary women of the Middle Ages. She was a German Benedictine abbess, a writer, composer, philosopher, mystic, and visionary. Her rebellion wasn't one of swords or faked deaths, but of intellectual courage and spiritual authority that often put her at odds with the male-dominated church hierarchy. From a very young age, Hildegard experienced powerful visions. For many years, she kept these experiences mostly to herself, fearing disbelief or condemnation. However, in her early 40s, she felt a divine command to write down what she saw and heard. Despite her own doubts and the initial skepticism of some churchmen, she began to document her visions in her famous work, Scivias, Know the Ways. This act itself was rebellious for a woman of her time to claim direct divine inspiration and to write theology. Hildegard didn't just write about her visions, she acted on them. She founded her own monastery at Rupertsberg near Bingen, a move that required considerable determination to achieve against the wishes of her abbot. She also went on several preaching tours, speaking publicly about religious renewal and clerical corruption, something virtually unheard of for a woman. She wrote hundreds of letters offering spiritual guidance, but also, at times, stern admonishment to some of the most powerful people in Europe, including popes, kings, and even the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick Barbarossa. She didn't shy away from criticizing their failings, believing she was speaking God's truth. One of the most dramatic instances of Hildegard's defiance came late in her life. Her community at Rupertsberg had buried a young man in their cemetery who had previously been excommunicated. Church authorities in Mainz demanded that Hildegard have the body dug up and removed. As excommunicated individuals could not be buried in consecrated ground, Hildegard refused. She argued that the man had repented and received the last sacraments before his death, and therefore was reconciled with the Church. When she stood firm, the ecclesiastical authorities placed her monastery under an interdict. This was a severe punishment. The nuns were forbidden to sing the divine office, their daily sung prayers a core part of their life and Hildegard's compositions, to receive communion, or to bury their dead with Christian rites. For Hildegard, who composed hauntingly beautiful music for her nuns, the silencing of song was particularly painful. Yet she did not back down. She wrote a powerful letter to the prelates, arguing that they were wrong and that silencing praise to God was a sin. After months of pressure and negotiation, and possibly with Hildegard providing further evidence or influential figures intervening, the interdict was finally lifted just before her death. Hildegard's life was a testament to her conviction that her spiritual insights were authentic, and that she had a duty to share them, even if it meant challenging the established order. Number 5. Clare of Assisi, the saint who fought the papacy for true poverty. Clare of Assisi, born into a wealthy, noble family in Italy around 1194, chose a path of radical rebellion against societal expectations, and even at times against the prevailing views within the church hierarchy. Her rebellion was a quiet but unyielding insistence on a life of absolute poverty for herself and her followers, the Order of Poor Ladies, later known as the Poor Clares. Inspired by the teachings and example of her contemporary, Francis of Assisi, Clare renounced her wealth and status. On the night of Palm Sunday in 1212, at the age of about 18, she secretly left her family's home, refusing an arranged marriage, and went to meet Francis. He cut her hair, signifying her renunciation of the world, and she took religious vows. This act itself was a defiance of her family, who tried forcefully to bring her back. Clare and her first companions settled at the church of San Damiano, near Assisi. From the very beginning, the cornerstone of their way of life was poverty. Not just individual poverty, where nuns owned nothing personally, but corporate poverty, where the community itself owned no property and possessed no fixed income, relying instead on daily alms. This was a radical idea, especially for an order of cloistered women. The church authorities, including successive popes, were deeply concerned about the practicality and security of such a life for enclosed nuns. They admired Clare's piety, but believed that an order of women needed the stability of endowments and property to survive. Pope Gregory IX, who was a friend and admirer of Clare, tried to persuade her to accept property for her order and to modify her strict adherence to poverty. He even offered to absolve her from her vow of poverty. Clare's reported response was firm. "Holy Father, I crave absolution from my sins, but I desire no absolution from the obligation to follow Jesus Christ." For decades, Clare fought to preserve this privilege of poverty, as it came to be known. She resisted multiple attempts by the papacy to impose a less stringent rule on her order, one that would allow for communal possessions. She wasn't being disobedient for the sake of it. She believed that this radical poverty was essential to her order's spiritual identity and its mission to follow the poor Christ. Clare took the extraordinary step of writing her own rule for her order, the first rule for a religious order known to have been written by a woman. This rule enshrined her vision of absolute poverty. It was a long struggle to get it approved. Finally, just 2 days before her death, in August 1253, Pope Innocent IV gave his official approval to Clare's rule. Her persistent, decades-long stand against immense pressure from the highest levels of the Church, all to live a life of what she considered authentic gospel poverty, marks her as a truly tenacious and principled rebel. Number 4. Katharina von Bora, the nun who escaped a convent and married the Reformation. Katharina von Bora's story is one of dramatic escape and a life that became deeply intertwined with one of the most significant upheavals in European history, the Protestant Reformation. Born in 1499 to an impoverished noble family in Saxony, Catherine was sent to a Benedictine convent at a young age and later moved to the Cistercian convent of Marienthron in München. She took her vows as a nun. However, by the early 1520s, the revolutionary ideas of Martin Luther and other reformers began to filter into even the closed world of convents. Luther's teachings challenged the spiritual value of monastic vows and advocated for the closure of monasteries and nunneries. Catherine, along with several other nuns at Marienthron, became convinced by these new ideas. They decided they wanted to leave the monastic life, which they now saw as unbiblical and spiritually unfulfilling. Escaping a convent was no simple matter. It was illegal and considered a grave sin. The nuns secretly wrote to Luther, asking for his help. Luther, who believed that monastic vows were not binding if they were contrary to conscience, agreed to assist them. He arranged for a merchant named Leonhard Koppa, who regularly delivered herring to the convent to smuggle the nuns out. On the night before Easter Sunday in 1523, Catherine and 8 other nuns, some accounts say 11, made their daring escape. They were hidden among Koppa's empty herring barrels in his covered wagon and spirited away from Marienthron. This act was a profound rebellion. These women were renouncing their sacred vows, abandoning their cloistered lives, and casting their lot with a religious movement condemned as heretical by the established church. Their escape caused a scandal, and they were, in effect, fugitives. Luther took responsibility for the escaped nuns, helping to find them homes, employment, or husbands. Catherine stayed for a while in Wittenberg, the heart of the Reformation. After a couple of potential marriage arrangements fell through, one of which she herself rejected, the strong-willed Catherine reportedly told Luther's friend, Nicholas von Amsdorf, that she would only consider marrying Luther himself or Amsdorf. Martin Luther, who had initially been hesitant about clergy marrying, eventually decided to marry Catherine in June 1525. Their marriage was hugely significant. It was a public and personal endorsement of clerical marriage, a direct challenge to centuries of Catholic tradition. Catherine, or Cath, as Luther affectionately called her, became much more than just a wife. She was a formidable partner to Luther. She managed their large household, the former Augustinian monastery in Wittenberg, known as the Black Cloister, which was always full of students, visitors, and children. She managed the finances, farmed land, brewed beer, and created a stable home environment that allowed Luther to focus on his work of writing and leading the Reformation. Katharina von Bora's rebellion was not just leaving a convent. It was embracing a new vision of Christian life and family that helped to shape the future of Protestantism. Number 3. The Nun of Watton Priory, a medieval tale of forbidden passion and savage retribution. The story of an unnamed nun at Watton Priory in Yorkshire during the mid-12th century is a dark and shocking one, illustrating the intense pressures of cloistered life and the brutal consequences when its rules were broken. Our main source for this account is Aelred of Bingen, a prominent Cistercian abbot and writer. In his work De Sanctimoniae de Watton, concerning the Nun of Watton. Watton was a Gilbertine priory, a type of double monastery that housed both nuns and canons, priests or lay brothers, in separate enclosures, though they shared a church. Aelred tells of a young girl who had been placed in the nunnery at a very young age, perhaps as an oblate, a child dedicated to monastic life by her parents. As she grew older, this nun, who Aelred portrays as initially resistant to the religious life, began a secret relationship with one of the lay brothers serving the community. Their illicit affair continued for some time, hidden from the rest of the community. However, the nun eventually became pregnant. The discovery of her pregnancy sent shockwaves through the priory. For the other nuns, this was a terrible scandal, a stain on the reputation of their house and a betrayal of their sacred vows. According to Aelred's account, the reaction of the other nuns was extraordinarily harsh. They reportedly imprisoned the pregnant nun. Then they somehow managed to get hold of her lover, the lay brother. What Aelred describes next is horrifying. He writes that the nuns in a furious rage forced the pregnant nun to be present while they, or someone acting on their behalf, castrated the lay brother. Some interpretations of Aelred's Latin even suggest they made her hold the severed genitals. The story takes an even more bizarre turn. Aelred, writing to bolster the reputation of the Gilbertine order and perhaps to show divine intervention, claims that after this brutal act, the pregnant nun was kept in chains. Miraculously, he says, her baby disappeared. Some accounts say 2 figures in white appeared and took the child, and the chains fell off her, signs interpreted as divine forgiveness following her, and the community's extreme penance. The Archbishop of York, Henry Murdoch, was apparently involved in the aftermath, and the nun was subjected to severe penance. Aelred's purpose in telling the story was complex, partly to show the dangers of sin, partly to highlight the possibility of repentance and divine mercy, and partly to address criticisms of the Gilbertine order. However, beneath the didactic purpose lies a chilling tale of forbidden love within monastic walls, a community's violent response to transgression, and the extreme measures taken to restore order and perceived purity. Whether every detail of Aelred's account is literal fact or contains allegorical elements, it paints a grim picture of one nun's rebellion against her vows and the terrifying justice meted out by her sisters in religion. Number 2. Abbess Euphemia of Wherwell, the head nun, accused of living large and ignoring the rules. Not all rebellious nuns broke vows of chastity or faked their deaths. Some, particularly those in positions of power like abbesses, rebelled by living lives of luxury, mismanaging their institutions, and flagrantly disregarding the authority of bishops who tried to correct them. Abbess Euphemia de Walliers of Wherwell Abbey, a Benedictine nunnery in Hampshire, England, provides a vivid example from the late 13th century. Wherwell Abbey was an ancient and wealthy institution, and its abbess was a significant figure. However, during Euphemia's tenure, things seem to have gone seriously downhill, at least according to official visitation records. Bishops had the duty to periodically inspect the monasteries and nunneries in their diocese to ensure they were being run properly, both spiritually and financially. When Archbishop John Peckham visited Wherwell in 1284, he was appalled by what he found. Peckham's report painted a picture of a nunnery in disarray. He declared that Wherwell had become a house of ill fame. He accused Abbess Euphemia of ruling not as a shepherdess of souls, but as a ravening wolf. The specific charges were numerous. The nuns, under Euphemia's lax leadership, were reportedly chattering and laughing during church services instead of praying. They had abandoned the communal dormitory for private rooms, a practice frowned upon as it could lead to worldly comforts and a lack of oversight. They were wearing rich, secular-style clothing and jewelry instead of simple habits. Furthermore, the Archbishop found that the abbey's finances were in a terrible state due to Euphemia's extravagance and mismanagement. She was accused of lavish feasting and entertaining lay people, including her own relatives who were living at the abbey's expense. The proper keeping of accounts had been neglected, and the abbey was sinking into debt. The care of the sick in the infirmary was also found to be wanting. Archbishop Peckham issued a series of strict injunctions demanding immediate reforms. He ordered Euphemia to correct her ways, enforce discipline, manage the abbey's resources responsibly, and dismiss her superfluous relatives and servants. However, Euphemia seems to have been a strong-willed and well-connected woman. Reforming such an abbess was not easy. 2 years later, in 1286, when Bishop Nicholas of Ely, acting for the Bishop of Winchester, visited, he found Euphemia to be old and inefficient, and many problems persisted. There were still complaints about financial mismanagement and lax discipline. Despite the efforts of church authorities, Euphemia managed to hold on to her position for many more years, until her death or deposition around 1297. Her story, preserved in the dry official records of episcopal visitations, reveals a different kind of medieval nuns' rebellion. Not an escape from the system, but a comfortable defiance from within it, by an abbess who seemingly preferred the privileges of her office to its spiritual responsibilities. Number 1. Jeanne Daubenton, the mystic, who chose the flames over renouncing her faith. The story of Jeanne Daubenton, also known as Jeanne de Brigue, is one of profound spiritual rebellion that led to the ultimate sacrifice. Living in Paris in the early 14th century, Jeanne was connected to the Bingen movement. Biguines were women who chose to live devout religious lives in communities, often without taking formal lifelong vows like nuns in established orders. They dedicated themselves to prayer, good works, and sometimes mystical contemplation. This way of life, existing somewhat outside the direct control of the church hierarchy, sometimes attracted suspicion. Jeanne Daubenton became associated with the ideas of Marguerite Porete, another Biguine, and the author of a controversial mystical book called The Mirror of Simple Souls. This book described a state of spiritual perfection where the annihilated soul achieved such union with God that it transcended the need for virtues, the sacraments, and the laws of the Church. Such ideas were considered dangerously close to or identical with the heresy of the free spirit. Adherents of the free spirit movement were believed to teach that those who reached a certain level of spiritual enlightenment were incapable of sinning and were free from obedience to church law. The ecclesiastical authorities, particularly the Inquisition, were on high alert for such teachings. In 1308, Marguerite Porete was arrested in Paris by William of Paris, the Inquisitor of France. She refused to renounce her book or her beliefs. Jeanne Daubenton was also arrested, along with a male adherent named Guillard de Cressenesart. They too were accused of holding heretical beliefs aligned with the Free Spirit movement. The trial records indicate that Jeanne, like Marguerite, was questioned about her beliefs regarding the soul's union with God and its freedom from ordinary religious constraints once perfected. Both women displayed remarkable courage. Despite imprisonment and the threat of death, they reportedly refused to recant. They stood by their understanding of spiritual truth, an understanding that emphasized direct personal experience of the divine over unquestioning obedience to external church structures. For the Inquisitors, this was an unacceptable challenge to church, authority, and doctrine. On June 1st, 1310, Marguerite Porete was burned at the stake as a relapsed heretic in the Place de Grève in Paris. A short time later that same year, Jeanne Daubenton and Guillard de Cressenesart met the same fate. They too were condemned as heretics and handed over to the secular authorities to be burned. Jeanne Daubenton's rebellion was not against monastic discipline or for personal freedom in a worldly sense. It was a rebellion of conscience, a steadfast adherence to her mystical beliefs in the face of one of the most powerful institutions of the medieval world. She chose to die rather than compromise what she believed to be true about God and the human soul. Her story, though less widely known than Marguerite Porete's, is a chilling testament to the risks faced by those, especially women, who dared to explore spiritual paths that diverged from officially sanctioned doctrine in the Middle Ages. Her defiance was in her unshakable conviction, a conviction that led her to the flames,